for sustainability leaders, but really for any leader within the company. So understand that it always has been, but especially now in the context that we're in, when there's no separation between the office wall and the rest of the world. In that dynamic, we are constantly challenged to see how we can balance considerations of economic performance, social considerations, and environmental. And to say that we have a legal framework and a fiduciary obligation to only focus on the economic ignores the fact that the environmental and social are increasingly breaking down the barriers. You can't silo these because environmental and social considerations are having material effects every single day, every minute of the day, short-term, medium-term, long-term, on economic results.
Sustainability is no longer just a check-the-box exercise. It's a strategic growth driver. But with growing pressures from all sides, how can businesses thrive in the era of impact and backlash? Today, we're joined by Steve Rochlin and Jeff Senne, co-authors of Sustainability Tension Management, How Companies Can Thrive in the Era of Impact and Backlash, released this week on Trellis. In this episode, we dive into what tension management is and why it's critical for business success, the 6 sustainability archetypes companies fall into, how to bridge the gap between strategy and execution, why we're now in the sustainability impact era and how to maximize it, and turning sustainability into a competitive advantage instead of compliance. So let's meet our guests. Jeff Senne is a global sustainability and ESG strategist with over 20 years of experience helping Fortune 100 companies, multilateral organizations, and investors align sustainability with business growth. As founder and CEO of Sandbar Solutions, he advises executives on leveraging ESG for competitive advantage, risk management, and stakeholder trust. Known for turning complex sustainability challenges into actionable strategies, Jeff has worked across 40 countries, integrating climate action, DEI, and corporate responsibility into core business operations. He's a multilingual leader, an avid kite surfer, and he brings a pragmatic, results-driven approach to navigating today's sustainability landscape.
And Steve Rochlin is a pioneer in ESG value creation, helping companies measure and maximize the financial impact of sustainability. As the CEO of Impact ROI, he advises global enterprises on integrating ESG into strategy, providing its ROI for profit, people, and planet. With over 20 years of experience across industries, he is the lead author of the Project ROI Research Series, which provides a business case for sustainability. Steve specializes in designing impact-driven strategies, helping companies move beyond compliance to real business and societal impact. If your company is feeling the push and pull of sustainability, this conversation is for you. So Dan, let's jump in. Jeff and Steve, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Really excited to dig into the topic of sustainability today. But before we do, we'd love to learn a bit about yourselves. Who you are, where you come from, and what fires you up. What are you both passionate about? Jeff, let's start with you.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for having us here. Excited for the conversation. My name's Jeff Senne. I am the CEO founder of Sandbar Solutions, a consultancy in the corporate sustainability space. Before that, I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers for many years, started my career in corporate sustainability at the United Nations Global Compact and worked at the African Development Bank, and just back from 3 years in Argentina. So delighted to be with you.
That's great. What gets you fired up? Jeff?
Kite surfing is my personal passion. What fires me up professionally is I really approach this as a kind of experiment of if we were going to design a perfect system that, drove optimal outcomes for the broadest set of people, would this be it? Is our government functioning the way we want it to? Is our business sector? Is our civil society, academics? whether that's, houses of worship or what have you. Is the system producing the best outcomes? And I would argue not. We have some tinkering to do. And my focus in that tinkering is the role of business in society.
Yeah. Okay. Love it. And you were just saying before we started that you just had 3 years in Argentina. How did you end up there? And what was the kind of biggest highlight?
Well, my wife works for the Inter-American Development Bank, got a position running climate finance for the bank in Argentina. And I followed her there. And then she got a promotion and got called back to Washington. And so I followed her here. And great experience, especially we have a 12-year-old son. And so it was really great for him. He's now trilingual and reminds me or at least he thinks he's better in all 3 languages than I am. And he may be right.
That's so awesome. Dan and I always talk about this based on your recent real-time experience, stability for a kid or throw lots of challenges, unique locations, people. Does that breed more adaptability and depth and resilience? Like, what have you learned through the experience?
Whatever you do, the kid will think you're doing it wrong. That's what I've learned. So whichever path you choose, it's incorrect.
Okay, love it.
And you will feel that it's incorrect, because that is one thing that I've learned about parenting. It's just a constant source of lack of self-confidence and self-questioning, and am I doing it right? And so rest assured, you're not alone.
That's so great. And Steve, what gets you fired up? What are you passionate about?
Yeah, Gareth, Dan, thank you so much for inviting us. Very, very excited to be here. I'll just give you a quick background. I've been in this sustainability, ESG, social impact world for almost 30 years, and started as the head of research and development for the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, and led the North America and Global Advisory Services for Accountability before founding Impact ROI, which is a leading strategic and boutique advisory firm on all things sustainability and the social environmental side. And have co-authored a couple of books on the connection of sustainability to the business. And what gets me fired up, professionally, similar to what Jeff was saying, I'm really fascinated in terms of how economic systems work and whether or not there's more value to be created financially for shareholders, for customers, employees, communities, all together by being more responsible, more ethical, better with the environment. We've done a lot of research looking at the business benefits and the financial business case. We have one of the leading studies on that. We're refreshing it right now. So that gets me very fired up on the professional side. On the personal side, family, friends, but also my wife and I have started a charity theater troupe, of which I'm the sort of artistic director and main writer. So we put on 2 shows a year for charity with a bunch of professionals in the Washington area.
That's great.
So that's good fun.
Is there a theme to the plays, or a genre that you specialize in?
Yeah, generally we do anything that's over 50 years old, and I'm starting to realize that that's starting to get into some of the core of my favorite shows and movies and things when I was growing up, and that's very unnerving. And generally do sort of light comedies because there's too much of a burden to put too much drama on people in Washington these days.
That's great. Managed this Christmas to take the family back to the UK and expose them to the pantomime experience, which is really fun. Good for the adults and for the kids all at the same time. It was awesome.
I'm going to have to hear about this. That's great.
Yeah. Well, so gentlemen, I'd love to hear about how you guys came together. A big part of this conversation is really focused on your report, sustainability, tension management. And I'd be curious to get a little bit of the backstory on how the 2 of you came together to co-author this paper. We'll dig into the many of the details of this, but give us a little bit of the background. How did it come about, and what's driving you to dive into this research?
What's great is that Jeff and I have known each other for 20, 25 years at this point, and just sort of saw kindred spirits when he was working at the United Nations Global Compact, and it really connected and have been sort of part of our professional and personal lives since then. So that's great. And now that Jeff has sort of hung his own shingle up, we collaborate and sort of work almost as an integrated team. We sort of use each other's brands as necessary, depending on the work, but very much attached at the hip on a lot of things. And what was interesting is that Jeff and I were both sort of struggling with some of the things we were hearing with our clients and our longtime friends and networks in the sustainability world. Because one thing about sustainability, both on the environmental and social side, is that it's been perpetual best of times, worst of times in this space, but never more acute, I think, than in the last 2-3 years, where you had this situation where, like around 2022, it was almost like this euphoric moment where investors finally said, okay, we think all of this environmental and social stuff is important. Customers seemed to come along, and employees had for a while, communities, even politicians. And it seemed like there was this mainstreaming moment. But then as soon as you got that, you got huge backlash that's coming from mostly the political right, but not entirely, also the left with anti-greenwashing laws and some skepticism about ESG. And you also had this situation in which sustainability had always been a voluntary construct for companies, but now you were starting to get regulation from Europe and other states. And suddenly people running this were kind of at loose ends. On the one hand, they were saying we're getting all kinds of support and belief and backing from the C-suite. On the other hand, it's almost we're feeling like this is about to be disbanded. We're about to lose our jobs. Our jobs are kind of starting to suck. In terms of feeling more compliance oriented. And it's both euphoric and completely unhappy. What do we do about it? And so Jeff and I put our heads together and said, we're seeing this. Let's start talking to people, see what they're seeing, what they're doing. And we had conversations with over 40 leading chief sustainability officers and equivalents from, famous companies from across different industries in the US and Europe. And then we supplemented that with a lot of extensive research to come up and see if we could sort of understand this moment and understand how to resolve and address it and figure out, who and how do we sort of balance these tensions. And that's where the Sustainability Tension Management Report was born. Jeff, I don't know if you'd add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, as Steve said, we met, it must have been about 2004, something like that. And have been working together in one way, shape, or form since. And so it's, you have to look for force multipliers in this space because the space is so complex and there are so many different threads that intersect. I know you all focus on on-site energy and renewables, and that's one thread. And then there's circularity over here, and then there's DEI over there, and then there's a long list of issues, and that's just within the space. And then the kind of compounding, layers of the onion of, and I think Steve and I both look at this as this is a component of corporate strategy. And so that's a much broader conversation to include human resources and procurement and supply chain and legal and risk and operations, you name it, sales and marketing and PR. And so I think it's really great to work with Steve and then connect with people like yourselves to start to build a more holistic, understanding, narrative, and strategy about how to tackle some of these challenges. Because right now what we're seeing is there's really a divergence in terms of the strategy. For a long time it was shared value, and that seemed to be a dominant paradigm. And what I'm working on something that I'm saying, I think it's now about scared value. It's really, you see a lot of companies retreating and kind of going with the wind. And I can see why they would do that. They would make those decisions. They don't seem irrational. But that's not long-term thinking, and that's not long-term strategy. That's whack-a-mole, duck and cover. And so what we're trying to help illuminate is that there's a tension in the space, and there's a tension both at the operational level of sustainability and to the strategic level of sustainability. And, acknowledging, admitting, and focusing on that can make you much more effective in then designing and implementing a strategy to further whatever those goals are.
Mm, yeah, no, that really resonates. And so in a moment, we'll get into some of the more kind of detailed findings. But what would you say was the biggest illuminating insight that came out of this that maybe you didn't anticipate, or was maybe went against some of your prior thinkings going into this research?
One of the things that, really jazzed you, and if you go back to college and university days, when you have those moments when it's sort of like the obvious is illuminated for you. And I think that we had that kind of moment where this notion, and this was backed up in some academic research that we saw, and then in reviewing the interviews that we did and analyzing them, we saw that it was screaming out from what people were saying and struggling with. And that's this notion that tension management is actually a discipline. And when we think about tension management, the natural thing is we might think about, emotional tension management and sort of taking pharmaceuticals to help us. But really, what we need to do increasingly in business and leading business and leading management teams are really effective at understanding the tensions between economic, environmental, social needs, and understanding when you balance them. And one of the things that we do in the sustainability field is that there's this knee jerk of saying, well, sustainability is the secret to connect the dots and create these win-win sweet spots. And that's certainly true. But we have to acknowledge that you don't always end up with a win-win sweet spot. And that even when you find one, it's temporary because the world changes around you, contexts evolve. And you have to evolve with them. So it's never going to be static. It's always going to be dynamic. And that this idea that the best companies, the companies that are best at sustainability, and in fact, there's evidence that the companies that are just best at management in general are the ones where their decision makers are able to be sort of expert black belts in tension management and sustainability tension management in particular. And that was something that was just really illuminating and something that just seemed to lock in, make just a tremendous amount of sense, and open up this sort of world and pathway of saying, you know what, this is something that those in this field and those who have dedicated their vocation or their careers to it are actually very often naturally good at. They don't realize it. They need to strengthen their natural assets in this area. And they need to start sharing them more, because one of the interesting things is that those leaders in the C-suite are not necessarily very good at that. They haven't been trained to think that way, and they don't necessarily think in a sort of the systems way about these kinds of issues. Very, very good at what they do in terms of their subject matter expertise and sort of general and conventional management, but not necessarily in this area. And that was one of the biggest ahas, I think, that we found. But Jeff, what would you say in addition?
No, I think that's right. I think, at the highest level, as we think about kind of the emergence of a new era in the way of which we're thinking about sustainability, which we use the term the impact era, we think that sustainability is largely moving away from these series of commitments and people will be judged by their commitments to their actual impacts. And I like to point to, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, there was this huge uptick in number of companies that joined Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, or made DEI commitments. And I would argue that the vast majority of those, the boards or even the C-suites, had little to no understanding of what they were signing up to. And fast forward 2-3 years, then they kind of go, oh, wait a second, what have we done? And didn't really fully understand how to manage those programs and make them optimized for impact. And I think we're moving away to an understanding and if I think of as Steve said, the economic, social, and environmental, and I would add kind of governance as a component of that. If we think of that as a society or as our corporate kind of structure, who among us would say that our economic system, our social fabric in society and in the way in which society is functioning, whether this is locally, nationally, or globally, our environmental impacts or our governance is optimized? I think no one. And if we look back at, what history tells us is this is why, republics fall and, new systems take part. And, of course, we're living through a really kind of volatile political time where everybody, likes to speak in these broad, hyperbole, that the Democrats are, God knows what they are, and the Republicans are XYZ, and, this is all about the collapse of civilization. But there clearly are signs that we are overstaying our welcome in terms of the environmental impact on society, that inequality is something that has to be managed, and that, we look at the last few years of inflation, and you can blame it on whomever you want, but these are real tensions that exist for CEOs and individual consumers. So how do we manage that better to provide a more sustainable outcome for everyone in the system? And there are emerging discussions or strategies that I think are insufficient because they're not recognizing the tension that exists at the center of these conversations and at the center of the experience that we're all being part of, and happening at kind of a speed of light thing, a faster speed than we're able to keep up in terms of our strategy and our thinking on it.
Jeff, before we get into like the report, just a macro, you've said a few things that kind of caught my attention. I listened to a leadership talk the other day, and the guy said something that I didn't expect. And he said the businesses that are going to succeed over the next 10, 20 years are those that create psychological safety. It wasn't those who adopt AI, those who are most sustainable. It was those who can actually create a workforce where there's psychological safety. So you can have these conflicts, you can have these tensions, you can work through it. Are you seeing that we have the psychological safety to have this tension, or is that where it's breaking down, that people are actually kind of afraid of this topic and as a result aren't willing to have these robust conversations about it?
Well, I think there's a lot of fear. And in fact, I talked about shared value to scared value. I think there's a lot of fear in terms of C-suite members who are like, well, to Steve's point, I wasn't trained on this. I don't understand all of this. And by the way, we as a society have taken this conversation and we've made them part of our identity. And so I'm a this, you're a that. My father, he passed away a couple of years ago, but before he did, he was a hardcore Trump supporter. And he said something to me one day, he said, but you're a liberal. He didn't mean it as a compliment. And it was striking in that it was this like, you are this and therefore, and it comes with this whole litany of baggage with it, rather than a nuanced vision of like, hey, why do I believe what I believe, and what drives those thoughts and those beliefs. And I agree with that. This idea of psychological safety, we have to find ways in which to have these conversations about differences of opinion that are so deeply held and meaningful. And if that's not a tent, you don't have to go beyond the Thanksgiving dinner table to understand that tension. And then you fast forward into a corporate space. And in the corporate space, the conventional wisdom has been, there are no politics. We all go through some kind of screening device as we walk in the front door, and we lose this part of identity. That's just silly. So we're going to have to, find ways in which to have these discussions without them demonizing each other, and deal with these tensions in real and meaningful ways. And that's tough in a society. The famous saying of seek first to understand and then be understood. That's not the way our society is currently structured. We're having a conversation.
Yeah, I'm curious on the macro scale as well. One of the things that caught my attention that you had shared was around this systems-based thinking and in sustainability, the connectedness of everything. And I'm curious how the kind of historical quarter-to-quarter decision-making and short-term view is at play or at antithesis of the longer term sustainability. And I'll use sustainability in the word of business longevity, not even in the sense of planet and decarbonization, but just business continuity and sustainability, thinking years, if not decades ahead versus quarter to quarter. Do you have any thoughts on that and how that plays out here?
I mean, I think I was talking about systems, so I'll jump in. And so there's a lot of angst in the sustainability movement, not just in the sustainability movement, but other business movements about the tyranny of quarter to quarter Wall Street evaluations. What's interesting, though, is that there's fascinating economic theory, and some Nobel Prizes have been won, about how the market is able to sort of look into the future and make judgments on a quarterly basis in terms of the valuation as well. So what is it? Is it that everyone is doing short-term thinking, or is it that the market is actually able to factor in long-term thinking and see how a company is dealing with it and factor that into its valuations? And I think it's, the answer, like many things, is that it's a little bit of both. And that in particular, one of the things that comes out of the study that we have is it's very important as a company and as a leader to know thyself. And you see a lot in the sustainability world, in the world of systems thinking, in which there's not a lot of self-knowledge. And so what happens is that, much like the wonderful metaphor of the soccer game of 5-year-olds, there's just a lot of just racing after the ball willy-nilly. And so what we see is that we start seeing companies that have, for example, very, very little carbon footprint, absolutely showing tremendous ambition and stepping out to take gigantic leadership and saying, we're going to be carbon, neutral. We're going to be net zero. Maybe even we'll be carbon negative. And I'm not calling out any specific company who might have done that. I'm just saying that when you're a company that doesn't have a carbon emissions problem to begin with, why are you chasing after that soccer ball? And that is something that, and what happens then is that when the market sees a company doing something like that, the market, and research backs this up, will punish that company because they have the same reaction. You're not a carbon emitter, so why are you doing it? And so we get into these challenges. So the short-term versus long-term issue and the quarterly versus long-term is an issue. But that's the system that we have, and I think we have to work with it and understand that sometimes we're sort of we're missing the forest for the trees, and we're very often, for lack of a better term, mismanaging how we should start to try and connect the dots on these two. And one of the things that the research and the tension management research we've done, along with some additional research, showcases is that if we know ourselves, then we have to really take seriously what our industry is, what our company is, what our real challenges are, what the real concerns are. Maybe we're not a big carbon emitter. Maybe our real issue is a question in terms of how well we do or do not treat our employees. That's the thing that our major stakeholders, including Wall Street, are really paying attention to see if we have the kind of culture and environment where employees are happy, thriving, succeeding, being very productive, and being paid a fair wage, but not necessarily from the street in an exorbitant way. Something that's balanced where it needs to be. And that's the type of thing that we should be prioritizing. And that's the type of thing that the street will say, we see that you're taking an appropriate long-term view in terms of how you're dealing with culture. I think Costco is a great example of this, of how they will absolutely not compromise on the way they treat employees and their culture for both the short and the long-term success of their business. And generally, the street continues to reward them for that. And so that's the kind of sort of tension and balance and sort of long-term versus short-term coming together that we see leading companies engaging in.
Yeah, I like that. Well, I want to dive into the report, and I think one of the probably first places to start was that at least jumped out at me was a company having a look in the mirror moment and figuring out which of the 6 archetypes that you guys have identified they fall into. And for our listeners, I'll just read through what those 6 are, and then I'd love to hear from you guys. Like, what was there any sort of kind of breakdown amongst the companies that you interviewed and researched that kind of fall into those buckets? Is kind of one better at tension management than the other? But the 6 archetypes that you identified through the research were first, box checker. So they do only what is necessary. The next being brand and reputation driven. So they use sustainability to differentiate their company with key stakeholders. The third being immediate return driven. So they use sustainability to improve short-term financial performance and competitive advantage. Then impact and purpose focused. So they use sustainability to express the company's purpose and values. Then innovation driven. They use sustainability to innovate new business models, solutions, processes that generate new markets, more revenue, and or reduce costs. And then last being the risk reduction driven. So they use sustainability to mitigate risk. So across those archetypes, were there kind of ones that were maybe more common than others, and which ones were better at the tension management?
Yeah, I'll jump in first, and Jeff's definitely going to have some additional points of view. So in terms of our group, one of the things we'd like to do is we'd like to do big research that sort of looks at scale and surveys and assesses what are the most common. If we look at our group and our sample of the 40 plus that we dealt with in our interviews, say that the vast majority fell into 2, and that is, brand and reputation driven, not surprisingly, and risk reduction. And this is if we're looking at the world from the C-suite. If we're looking at the world from the sustainability and ESG team, almost all of them are going to be coming at this from impact and purpose driven. Now, one of the interesting things is when we're talking about big global companies, which is what we typically work with and deal with in this research and with our clients, you're not just going to have one sustainability archetype. You're going to have a dominant one, and then you're probably going to have 2 or 3 others. And then depending on where you go in the company, you may have different business lines which have different archetypes. And so we have to sort of balance all of these. And the interesting thing is that you can, with the exception of box checker, which we can talk a little bit about in a minute, with the other 5, you can succeed and thrive. Both in terms of sustainability performance and also business performance with any of the other ones. The ones, though, that seem to jump out at being particularly useful is that when you look at the immediate return driven and the innovation driven ones, those are the ones that naturally sort of connect the dots between sustainability and bottom line and top line business results. And those are the ones who are actually maybe a little bit further ahead in terms of system thinking and in terms of understanding that part of the job is finding where you can the sweet spot win-wins from economic, environment, and social considerations. And understanding that when you can't find those sweet spots, making tough choices in terms of how to balance going forward. And those are the ones that sort of have that natural affinity. They're learning, they're trying, they're experimenting. And that's why they're a little bit ahead. You can certainly do wonderful results if you're focused on risk reduction or brand and reputation. And also, you look at Patagonia, which is the classic example of an impact and purpose-focused archetype. All of those do have things in their favor. But you will find in those archetypes sometimes the natural way of proceeding, the intuitive way for leaders and decision makers proceeding, actually emphasize conflict and don't emphasize resolution of the tension sufficiently, that some of the choices they make creates more conflict rather than trying to find ways to deal honestly with the tensions that you're trying to confront. So those are some of the things that I would say have come out of our research. But Jeff, what would you add?
Can I just ask, before you jump in, Jeff, do you find that the company's archetype represents the leadership personality archetypes, or is it more the company goes on a journey from we start as a box checker and then we realize actually there's some benefits to this, and then they start shifting into the other archetypes? Does it work both ways? Is there a way that it often works?
I mean, I would say yes to all that.
Yeah.
Jeff, I could say more, but if you want to jump in, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Like Gareth, you're picking up on something that I think is really interesting in the space, which is the lies we tell ourselves. And I love Steve's framing of like know yourself, and and this is a critical point in the space. One of the things that I've talked about for years is when you hire somebody in this space, never be the first hire for a sustainability professional, because they have to go through their broken heart period. And I don't have the emotional bandwidth to do that for too many more people, because I've done it too many times of picking people up off the floor and helping them through that kind of emotional resilience phase, because this is a tough space. You are screaming in the wind a lot. And you got to figure out how to do that. And we tell ourselves as professionals in this space, we have these series of things that we talk about that make us feel better about our jobs. Like, I'm here to work myself out of a job. I'm going to, anytime I read anywhere that, we've built it into the DNA of our company, I roll my eyes and slightly vomit into my mouth. It's just so ridiculous, because the issues we're dealing with are fairly perennial. Like, we might figure out XYZ issue today, but then tomorrow it's going to be this, and tomorrow it's going to be that. Or that there's always a win-win in this space, and that somehow if you didn't figure it out, it's because you were unworthy and didn't try hard enough. Well, that's not true. There's not always a win-win between the tensions that we're dealing with. And sometimes it doesn't make economic sense, and you should do it anyway. And sometimes you could make some societal impact, but it really doesn't pencil out for the company, and you probably shouldn't do it. Like this, there is a dance to this. I'm a big fan of this idea, given my focus on like the role of business in society. 5 years ago, or maybe more than that now, 10 years ago, every corporate leadership team read Simon Sinek's book on why, or they read some Harvard article, and they all needed a corporate purpose. And they went out and got these corporate purposes, and they wrote them down and made a big splash about them. And I like the conversation around corporate purpose, because for me, that is a conversation about the role of business. Like, why are we here? Why do we exist? What it was reduced to was a series of bumper stickers that companies like, we're this. I worked with a company that was great. Like, we did a survey of the staff to see and this was a simple question: what is our purpose? It had been on their website. They'd been talking about it in leadership teams. It'd been all over the place. 17% of respondents got it right. So a dog pressing one of 5 buttons could have had better results. Like a random survey of anybody off the street could have had better results. Like, it was unbelievable. And so the answer to that was, we need to do a better job of telling people what our purpose was. No, you actually need a better purpose and a better understanding of how that connects to your actual culture and what you seek to achieve as a group. It should be organic. It should be natural. People should naturally kind of figure it out. But that's not how that has kind of played out. And I think far too many companies have created theatrical corporate responsibility programs rather than impact ones. And I think that's the fundamental shift that we're seeing. And some of that's driven by compliance, which I know a lot of people are pushing back and saying, hey, now my job feels like it's compliance based. And yeah, well, be careful what you wish for. We all wanted more regulation. We all wanted more supply chain engagement. And then that led to a proliferation of supply chain surveys. And we wanted more compliance. We got that. And, I get the unintended consequences of this. But fundamentally, I think corporate sustainability is better than it was 5 years ago. And that might not feel better, but we're fundamentally having more adult conversations about how this builds corporate and societal value and measurable value, and when it does and when it doesn't, and what we should do about it, than we were.
Yeah, that really resonates. And I think I've seen a real kind of evolution as well. One of the things I want to talk a little bit about is you've touched, Jeff, a little bit on sweet spots, and that there are areas where we can find sweet spots, and then there's not always sweet spots to be had, but it doesn't mean that you should shy away from something. So when I was going through the report, you mentioned that there was 3 archetypes: immediate return driven, innovation driven, and impact and purpose focused, that were more likely to find the sweet spots. And it actually made me think about arguably my favorite sustainability leader that I've been working with recently, who comes from Fortune 100, VP of Sustainability, Fortune 100, but they come from a finance background. And so it makes me think about the conversation we had of when we're talking about on-site energy. He was saying, we've got a lot of things that we need to do, and some of those things are going to cost, and therefore they probably don't fall in a sweet spot. However, I see on-site as being an area where, rather than me going and asking for something, I can actually bring something to the organization. I can bring it to our finance and strategy and C-suite leadership to say, here's an area where I can save us millions, tens of millions, or as we look across the whole portfolio, hundreds of millions into billions of dollars. So in that case, I'm not kind of coming with my hands empty and asking for something. I'm bringing something to the table, which largely would fall into the sweet spot. Can you touch on some of those sweet spots that you've found, and how companies can get some groundswell internally to get these projects moving?
Steve, you should take this, given the link to Project ROI.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. One of the things that's out there, and this has become an incredibly politicized debate right now, is whether or not there's a business case for sustainability. And there's this argument which, and it may even become illegal to do ESG related investing. And what's fascinating is that the research that we did initially, Impact ROI and Babson College collaborated and did a report I was the lead author of on Project ROI, looking at the business case for this. And we're in the middle of doing a refresh right now and expanding our research. We did an extraordinary, wide review of academic literature on this. And the sweet spots are real. They exist. And there are a few things. Number one, you absolutely can generate financial value, both in short-term, medium-term, and long-term, from what you do in environmental and social sustainability, but only if you do it well. And that seems like the most obvious statement in the world, but actually it's not, because there's an argument, which has only become more acute in 2025, that says everything that we do in sustainability is valuable, versus those who say that absolutely everything we do in sustainability is destructive of value. And the answer is that no, like everything else, if you do it well, if you think in a systems way, if you do tension management, if you know yourself and you do the right things, then you actually can find these sweet spots and create value in a litany of ways. For example, from the original research, and we'll have the updated figures on this, you have the potential to improve your share price by up to 6%. You have the potential to increase sales by up to 20%. You have the potential to reduce employee turnover by half. You have the potential to increase your market value as a whole by 11%. These are the types of things that you can do. And you can reduce specific costs and specific risks. So how do companies actually go about thinking about this? Well, we found some fascinating examples over our careers, but more recently from our research, there was one company that we worked on that the chief operating officer was brand new, was supervising and sort of also playing the CFO role, and set out a clarion call that said, we have to get more disciplined as a company, and we're going to do a series of financial audit and a productivity audit. And I want volunteers for who's the most courageous to step up and say, put my business line under scrutiny to see where we can extract and reduce costs and increase productivity of your assets and performance. And every single business line unit just cowered. And the only person to raise their hand was the chief sustainability person, who said, tell you what, we're going to look at our products from a sustainability lens, and those products that have actually embedded good environmental features, both in terms of their production and in terms of what we're marketing to our customer. And we're going to see how that looks. And I'm going to put myself out there. And if it turns out that I am the cost center that you expect me to be, then you do what you will. Cut us to the bone if necessary. But I'm going to bet that you're going to find out that we're not a cost center, that in fact we're reducing costs and that we're net profitable for our organization. And the new CEO said, well, it's your funeral, but I appreciate that you were courageous, so let's have at it. And they picked sort of a sample of a couple of dozen products to do these sort of sustainability audits on. And they looked at these things which were embedding, lower emission, better for biodiversity, low water use, low energy use types of facets in it, and low waste. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know that these products were radically more productive, more efficient, lower cost to produce, to sell, to distribute, logistical distribution, et cetera, than the products which had not gone through sort of the sustainability ringer. And the CEO said, hallelujah, I am a convert, and you are now my favorite person. And not only are we going to do the financial audits that I was talking about, but we're going to have a sustainability lens across the board, across the business. Everyone's going to go through this. And so, right now the sustainability leader is a hero, and that's a great example of the tension management process leading to a sweet spot, and leading to fantastic results for the business. So there are others, but in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
We see these returns on investment every day, Steve, and I think it's very evident to ourselves on this call that when sustainability is done right, it's actually the most profitable outcome for a business. But in your report, you say C-suite executives say 68% of them say they've got a really robust sustainability plan, but then 98% of large companies don't achieve their planned objectives. Where does that cultural friction come from? And how do we, based on your findings, how do we set up companies and leadership teams to be successful and go and execute on those plans that have been set? Or are we setting the wrong plans in the first place?
First of all, I think it's important not to demonize C-suites for fumbling sometimes on these things. I'm reminded of a story that I was told by somebody who worked at Patagonia, and Yvon Chouinard was there. And this was after the Don't Sell This Jacket or Don't Buy This Jacket campaign that was a wildly successful sales campaign, ironically. And Yvon came to a meeting and said, okay, next year our sales goals are to increase by X, and our environmental goals are to decrease impact by Y. And, somebody raised their hand and said, aren't those, contradictory, or aren't we swimming against each other here? And he said, yeah, that's the job. And turned around and walked out. His goal there wasn't to answer it for everyone, but to say, yes, there is a tension there. And our goal as a leadership team is to figure out and manage within that tension. And so, it's easy to think of like, oh, well, Patagonia got this done because they didn't have any tensions because, it was all easy. Well, that's not right. And then there's plenty of other examples of how companies are dealing with. I was in a meeting with a client with their PR team said, the sustainability team said, hey, we need to talk about this differently. And the PR team said, well, if you give us better programs, we'll give you better PR. I was like, oh, well, there's a little tension, and there's tension because, sales oversold it and operations didn't deliver it or vice versa. Who knows? These tensions are ever present in our lives in companies. And sustainability just is one of those that you need and has some special ability to either build bridges or not. And so what we're saying is that for sustainability professionals, build the bridge, use sustainability as a means of getting more than one thing out of it and diminishing tensions or acknowledging and leveraging tensions. Steve, what did I mean?
Yeah, I completely agree. And just to build on that, One of the interesting things is that the process of setting a sustainability strategy is actually not like strategy setting in other parts of the business. And that's why we start to see some of these disconnects in terms of C-suite saying we've got a strategy and their employees saying, I don't think we do. And companies making commitments, but then having these numbers where it doesn't look like they're making progress on these commitments. And so what we found is that the companies that do the really good job, number one, put sort of the tension management at the core. And there's sort of a process that we've identified. And the first thing is this: know yourself. And part of knowing yourself is knowing who your key stakeholders are and knowing what your key stakeholders expect of you. And that makes a huge difference. And that's something that's bearing out in our business case research, that the companies that don't just understand themselves, but understand what their investors, their customers, their employees, their communities, environmentalists expect in terms of their sustainability performance in a real way. They really listen and follow up and align that with the kind of business they're in, the kind of industry they're in. Those are the ones that create the best strategies, get the best results, get the best business results too from sustainability. So that's number one: know yourself and know what your stakeholders expect of you. Number two, go through this process where you understand the dominant archetypes that are driving the company. You could have a reflection and say maybe you want to change those archetypes, but if that's too difficult to do, then you understand at the very least, if we're brand and reputation driven, then, and we can't fight the wind right now and change that, even if we'd like to, then let's lean into it and let's use the strengths of that archetype for us to propel us forward and understand how supporting brand and reputation kind of goals in this will allow us to balance economic, environmental, and social tensions. The next thing is that there's a core set of strategic questions that companies need to start asking and answering themselves. And I won't go through all of them, but we have to start sort of reflecting in a more strategic way than is often done in the field and starting to say, well, how important is it to be known for our sustainability by the wider public? Who needs to know that we're good at sustainability? What's happening on compliance? Or how are we going to be affected by new regulations, both informal and voluntary standards? Relationships, who are the strategic relationships, non-traditional relationships that we need with NGOs, with environments, with communities that are going to help us win? And that's a question that almost seems a little bit unseemly, but that's the type of question, that companies need to ask and answer. And there are a number of other things that need to go into that strategic assessment process that are part of this. The next thing is to understand, well, what is our business case? Because there's lots of different business cases out there, but really they boil down to their three. And certain business cases will make more sense for certain industries and certain companies within those industries. And the three really are, number one, are we going to focus on a business case that relates to cost reduction? Or are we going to focus on a business case that relates to growth, of sort of responsible, sustainable growth? Or are we going to use a business case that relates to sort of positioning and our reputation and build off of that? And sort of picking one or two of those lanes, probably not all three, and sort of following that. And then once you've answered, gone through those first 4 or 5 steps, then that's when understanding, well, what are the right commitments for us to make? What are the plans that we need to do to deliver on those commitments and the programs that we need? And usually what happens in strategy setting is that companies start with that last step first. And they say, let's throw some commitments against the wall and see what sticks, and have some targets and go after it then. And that's not the best way to go about it.
Well, one of the things that I want to make sure we touch on is, and Jeff, you had touched on it, but I want to spend a few minutes on this, which is you guys talk about us ushering in the sustainability impact era. And like, what does that mean? And how are we going to see companies adopt that? I mean, when I was reading about it, it seems like it was, rather than having sustainability be a part or a piece of strategy, it's how does it fit within and or inform the overall strategy? But what is the sustainability impact era mean, and what are we going to see? How are we going to see companies differently in 5-10 years? I don't know what the horizon is that you're thinking.
Well, I think it's really interesting. First of all, who holds companies accountable for their sustainability commitments? Pretty much no one, right? 98% aren't being made, and very few people are saying, well, I'm not going to buy from that company if they don't do this, or I'm not going to invest in that company. So I think sustainability, the societal impacts have not been held. The companies haven't been held accountable for the commitments they're made. So the commitments are not the thing. The thing is okay, where can we make measurable impact? And I think companies are going to have to get that. This is hard because they're going to have to say no to things. When I was working at Sodexo many years ago, we were working on cage-free eggs, and I went to one of our stakeholders. We were in stakeholder conversations, and I went to them and I said, that's going to cost us X. And I think that money's more well spent on over here. Not that I don't think that issue is important, but I think I'm going to get there because the state of California is going to regulate it, and that's going to cascade through the marketplace. And McDonald's and Burger King are doing it, and they're going to move the market. So I'm going to ride that wave, and I'm going to focus my efforts where I think I can have more, force multiplier effect and move the market. That was an uncomfortable conversation. That is not what that stakeholder wanted to hear. But he turned to me and he said, thanks for your honesty. And he said, I appreciate it because most of the people in your job would shine me on and this and that. I'm going to continue to push you. And in the court of public opinion, I'm going to say you should do this. But I at least appreciate that, where you're coming from and how you're thinking about this, how you're managing the resources you have and what you can do. I think those kinds of conversations, those kinds of strategy decisions are critical and are not always being made. The second thing I'll say is when 3 or 4 years ago, like ESG was on everybody's lips and it seemed, Forbes was talking about it and Fortune and New York Times and everybody was like pro ESG. Everybody seemed to forget that they seemed to think that the business case was made then. Now shareholders are invested in this idea. All that meant was that the investors were listening now for the first time. They were actually listening. Now you had to tell them your strategy and the business case. And in fact, that's not what most companies did. They said, okay, we've arrived. Now we just tell them about our programs, not the impacts. Well, look how that turned out. So now we need to transition to a much more robust conversation about this is what we're doing and this is why it matters. And this is why I think there's a bunch of companies out there green hushing and retreating. And I understand that. That's not an irrational response in this modern moment. But I'm much more interested in the companies that are saying, hey, wait a second. We created this strategy for a reason. We understand the impacts it has on our business. Here they are. Here's the time frame over which they play out. And this is why we're going to stay the course. And that doesn't mean that we're not listening to critiques where we get it wrong.
And just to reinforce what Jeff is saying, I mean, he really illustrates the impact area and sort of bottom line. It's, I think a lot of companies and different individuals within companies got excited about the process of making commitments and having programs. And I think what different stakeholders in the world are coming back is we really got excited when we used to hear a company, for example, say, we're going to make a net zero carbon commitment. And that excitement lasted up until about, again, 2022. And something is flipped. And now it's, ho-hum, we're bored by the commitment. We want to say, have you gotten to net zero yet? And companies are saying, well, whoa. You did hear the part that says we're going to get there by 2045 or 2050, right? And people are saying, I'm not impressed by that. The world's on fire. Show me how, literally on fire. Show me how you're going to be making progress. And if you can't get to net zero by tomorrow, at least show me that you're making progress on the journey. And that's another way of looking at the impact era. That some of the things that were seen as being leadership, not just acceptable, but being leadership in terms of trying hard, are no longer embraced. You actually need to start showing results for anyone to pay attention, care, applaud, or on the flip side, to stop them from becoming more activist towards you.
Yeah. Love the shifting into an impact era. To close us out, what would be your individual advice to sustainability and business leaders listening in to really maximize the impact era?
For sustainability leaders, but really for any leader within the company, so understand that it always has been, but especially now in the context that we're in, when there's no separation between the office wall and the rest of the world. In that dynamic, we are constantly challenged to see how we can balance considerations of economic performance, social considerations, and environmental. And to say that we have a legal framework and a fiduciary obligation to only focus on the economic ignores the fact that the environmental and social are increasingly breaking down the barriers. You can't silo these because environmental and social considerations are having material effects every single day, every minute of the day, short-term, medium-term, long-term, on economic results. And so understanding that, and understanding that the name of the job of leadership right now is balancing those tensions. Going back, Gareth, to a point that you made, part of that is the emotional dimension of that, and creating psychological spaces for your talent to be able to exist, thrive, and function, and not just be anxiety-filled stress buckets in dealing with a world that these tensions can't be separated anymore, because that's a very sort of scary place to exist. And so, the advice is understanding that that's the name of the job, and building up the skills, capabilities, and implementing those into day-to-day activities. Those are the companies that are going to win and compete and succeed starting right now and into the future.
One of the people that we interviewed for this research said something that really struck me and stuck with me. When he talks to people in the leadership positions within the companies, he likes to ask two things. What keeps you up at night, and what are you incentivized to achieve? And then looking at ways in which the sustainability program either is a tailwind or a headwind to those two questions for that individual. And if it's tailwind, great, you've got a solution that can help. And if it's a headwind, at least you've recognized it and said, Jack Welch once said this. They were talking about GE, and he was talking about innovation in the space and how they were selling, they were supporting increased regulation in the energy sector because they saw it as a comparative advantage that they could sell more of this better equipment, and that created a tension with their customers who were buying the equipment. And they had to explain that tension of that. Why are you supporting more regulation? And they had to say, well, because blah, 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 blah. So, this is not, these tensions are going to exist. But if you ask those two questions at the individual level, because while we talk about this as a systems issue, it is, except when you're talking to the head of human resources or procurement or supply chain. The system doesn't feel it doesn't feel like a systems problem at that point. It feels like an individual problem for that leader.
I completely agree with that, and it's really interesting to see the dynamic of having to think through the big systems, but also the individual, and bridging that gap throughout the whole process. So I think it's perfect time for us to shift to our power surge round. We always like to close out with these three questions. So first and foremost, this will be a fun one. I'm curious your reaction to this. We always ask, if you could be any one energy technology, what would it be and why? So I don't know, Steve, maybe I'll start with you.
Got to go with fusion. Go big or go home. It's going to be that would be the transformative one. I know the joke about fusion energy is we're 5 years away from it coming online and always will be, but there's some promising breakthroughs on the horizon. So
I like it. Jeff?
Yeah, I like that one. I would say nuclear, controversial, but scientifically, a solution that is solvable and a critical part of the mix, I would argue.
I agree, and one that's clean and provides us that baseload power. So I agree. Where you guys are extremely well read and researched, so I think our listeners would be curious. Where do you typically consume your content? Do you have any recommended books, podcasts, newsletters, research? Anything that you might want to point out for our listeners?
It's almost overwhelming. I've been actually trying to go a little bit more towards the business side of things, Harvard Business Review and the like, but certainly have to give a shout out to Trellis and GreenBiz, not just because they're our partners, but because, we were hoping to have them as a partner because we respect what they put out there so much. And then there's one, that's easy, bite-sized to consume. A shout out to a friend of ours. I would recommend everyone follow Dave Stangus on social media because he always has incredibly useful, pithy information and posts, and also curates a lot of great stuff.
I would agree with both of those. I'm a big fan of putting this, and it won't surprise you or your listeners, as I talk about the role of business in society and how it connects to government and civil society. I like to really think about this in a geopolitical context. So I really like Ian Bremmer, G0 World. I'm a big fan of Sam Harris and his work. Malcolm Gladwell has an amazing podcast. And another amazing podcast out there is called Cautionary Tales, which is both entertaining, but also really illuminating about lessons from history that we seem to have forgotten or learned incorrectly, like took the wrong lesson away from it. And so those are all ones that I really like.
I like that. I've not heard that, but I will definitely check it out because I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a major history buff, but I think let's go make new mistakes and learn from the ones that have been made in the past. All right. Final question. And Jeff, I'll start with you. So what does this statement look like, either personally or professionally, in the context of sustainability? In my life, I will have been successful when?
I take risks.
I like it. Steve, finish the statement. In my life, I will have been successful when?
Really, when I'm able to contribute to understanding that there's sort of an integration that's not one extreme or the other, but that there's a way that we can find collaborative, balance, rational, reasonable approach to finding good results personally, from community, economically, environmentally, socially, just tying them together, and that I've contributed to it some way.
Beautiful. Gentlemen, really appreciate your time. I'm very excited to share your research with quite a few folks that are in my network that I'm working with on a regular basis, because I think it's going to help them in how they navigate these challenges within the organization and try to drive initiatives and projects forward. And really, the thing that resonated with me most was some of what we were touching on there at the end of this impact era and really enabling action. Like, there's so much planning, so much commitments that get done, but really when the rubber meets the road, like what are you actually doing and what's actually happening? We talk in our world that nothing, nobody benefits from anything until steel's in the ground, in the sense of energy. And so, and I appreciate that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your insights. And we'll be sure to put ways to engage with you guys in the show notes. But thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
This has been great, Dan. Great to learn about VECKTA. Thank you.
Man, Gareth, That was awesome. Well, there's so much there to digest. I really enjoyed hearing their perspective, and clearly there's a lot of challenges with getting sustainability projects going and actually making progress amongst all the other competing priorities within business. But based on the report and what you heard from Jeff and Steve today, what were some of the biggest takeaways for you?
I think it really resonates, especially the concept of tension management. I think it's really powerful for this subject because I think Dan and I, you and I see this all the time. There's so many stakeholders involved in business operations. And I think sustainability is often felt like they're being held off to the side, trying to force compliance versus actually being an integrated part of the leadership team, driving initiatives that are going to positively impact the organization holistically. And so I really enjoyed the concept of how do you drive that tension management across the organization? How do you get the chief sustainability officers and the teams more empowered, more integrated, speaking more strategically, understanding the concepts of returns on investment and actually thinking about this in monetary terms instead of just trying to push a particular initiative. And I think what really stood out for me, Dan, was they reference in their report some stats from Bain & Company, and they found in their research that in terms of change management efforts across all businesses, especially large ones, only 12% of change management processes are typically successful. But then for sustainability programs, it's 2%. So 98% of businesses are not delivering on their sustainability goals today. And I thought that was super interesting. And then on the flip side, they reference some benefits. The companies that actually do it well and do it right, they realize up to a 6% increase in share price, which is incredible. They realize 20% additional sales. They have 50% less staff turnover. They realize 11% better market value because they get boosts in their reputation. They're 13% more productive, and they have more market value because they reduce litigation risks by up to 4%. And so I thought, there's the trade-offs. Companies are struggling to deliver, but those that do realize massive downstream benefits. So how do we use this tension management strategy to ensure greater alignment across the organization, more empowerment, more delivery, and more pull-through? How about you?
I really enjoyed the component. I mean, I agree with you. The tension management is extremely important when trying to get these things done. But to kind of build on that, this whole concept of moving into the sustainability impact era, that was something that really resonated for me. And we're seeing it every day on the ground when we're working with large contracts and helping them push these projects forward. It really brought me back to my contrarian prediction for 2025 regarding the fact that sustainability projects, if they're or decarbonization more specifically projects, unless they have strong economics and strong financial returns, they're just not going to get off the ground. And I think that falls right into that sustainability impact era idea of you've got these projects that need to get done, but you have to tie them back to the broader business initiatives, meeting other objectives, meeting financial objectives in order to really get the buy-in across the organization. It also made me think back to one of our previous guests, Mike Dietrich, and his quote around working from within the system and understanding that we are in a capitalistic society. We are working within businesses, and the primary driver of business is financial growth. And so, okay, let's work within that to get these going. And the beautiful thing is, specifically within on-site energy, there are a lot of places that have really strong financial returns for deploying these systems. And so I enjoyed the digging in a little bit on kind of that on-site fitting within that sweet spot of financial returns, business risk management, and sustainability. So I appreciate their time and excited for leaders to dig into this and understand how they can bring a little tension to the boardroom and get some things accomplished.
Yeah, love it. All right, let's crack on. See you on the next one.
Sounds good.
Cheers. We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.